Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Glad to have so many people here joining us today. Thank you to CGO and NetChoice for hosting this, co-hosting this discussion today. We're going to be talking about taxing tech. Will state regulation harm consumers and raise prices? Before we get into some of the details of that, along with a great panel lineup of friends, I want to introduce another friend who is going to give us a few thoughts to kick us off, Lisa Nelson. Lisa Nelson is CEO of ALEC and has been for a number of years. Most importantly to me, a longtime friend and a fellow traveler in the world of innovation and technology policy and innovative thinking. Lisa, you have some words for us.
Oh, am I back on?
You are.
Thank you, Bartlett, and thank you to the Center for Growth and Opportunity for hosting this event, and to our longtime ALEC partner, NetChoice, for being involved as well. Both of your organizations are so important to state public policy and to us here at ALEC. ALEC represents the best of American democracy. It brings together citizen legislators like you, business leaders like you, and policy experts like you to discuss and debate public policy. We do this work because the challenges are many and the answers are not always as simple as they may seem. Every state is different, but by sharing and deeply vetting policy from every state, ALEC members develop a consensus, and as a result, our model policies pass into law as legislation at a greater rate than any other state-focused organization. Today's discussion will dive into how proposed state taxation of the technology sector could potentially harm consumers by raising prices, limiting options, and slowing innovation. There's a great deal going on across the country and state capitals on many issues, and specifically related to technology. And in many ways, it reminds me of the flurry of activity now is reminiscent of what I was addressing in technology issues while I was at AOL, or later when many innovation-related public policy issues arose at Visa, where I led their global policy work. These policy discussions are wide and varied, from taxation and competition to business models, to access to broadband, and perhaps most recently about the moderation of online content. And while each of these are important, it's not the issue at hand today. Believe it or not, we have now been living with an online world for close to 30 years, with many of the laws most directly affecting us put in place in the 1990s. A discussion and review of those policies is healthy, particularly as we see innovation continue to change the policy landscape. And this goes exactly to why ALEC is so important. These sorts of conversations continue to take place at ALEC, where state legislators from across the country exchange ideas for what works and what doesn't, to address the challenges that they and their constituents face now, but also to prepare for those challenges they will face tomorrow. As many are already aware, the innovation sector is one of the brightest spots in our national economy, and that translates to the brightest spots in many of the state economies as well. And state governments, legislators directly, rely so much on that same technology. Many of those same innovations are the ones who are delivering services to your citizens and helping you communicate effectively with voters. Our focus at ALEC on free markets and competition has been the underpinning of policy focus, and the economic understanding and conversation that is happening in every state legislative chamber has provided the perfect platform for those conversations to continue. And perhaps more importantly, it's the perfect platform for real-world, state-based solutions to be crafted that rest on principled public policy, that encourages economic growth, preserves economic security, and protects all hardworking taxpayers. At ALEC, ideas drive the discussion just as ideas drive our most innovative companies forward. Innovation and technology are at the forefront of ALEC members' conversations, and ALEC is home to experts who stay ahead of the issues, who provide continuing education to members about the impact and changing issues will have. Successful public policy in this arena will always have the betterment of all people as its goal. We have principles as a foundation, and will hope to always have liberty, opportunity, and growth as a result. So I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to open up this conference, and thank you, CGO, for that opportunity. I'm excited that you're all here. I'm excited to hear of the outcomes from your conversation and look forward to hearing back from all of you about the issues discussed today. Taxes on technology, whether financial or regulatory, that will ultimately harm consumers, harm constituents across the country. Thank you so much and have a great conversation.
Thank you, Lisa. You never disappoint. And thank you for those words about technology, state legislators, and principle of public policy. There's a lot to chew over, and hopefully over the next, looks like 52 minutes or so, we will have a chance to do exactly that. So thank you. I am Bartlett Cullen, for those of you who don't know. I was just looking at the attendee list, lots of familiar names and some new people. Always cool to make new friends and always great to be surrounded by old friends, as I'm lucky enough to be today with Lisa and the upcoming panel. One of the hats I wear is to be counsel at ALEC, where I also oversee the Center for Innovation and Technology. The center provides state lawmakers with guides, data, research, and structure to imagine and create a plan of action for how innovation can benefit their states. So whether improving processes, creating products, or developing new ideas, the center provides a place for breakout inspiration and examination for policy improvements. All very exciting stuff, and maybe most importantly is the excitement of getting to work with people just like you guys on who are watching and attending today. Today, I have a great panel joining us to discuss taxing tech, will state regulation harm consumers and raise prices? We'll have time later for questions in the program, so be thinking about those, preparing those, and we'll go ahead and do those by submitting the Q&A button, which, if I'm still in the middle of the screen, on your screen, should be directly below me. Just put the questions there. And if you don't mind waiting till a little later, it'll allow me to see them a little more real time and hopefully get to as many questions as we can. With that, let me introduce our panel. And I think they're going to pop up here on the screen as we go along. So first, let me introduce Katie McAuliffe, who is more than just a name on the screen, but while she's getting dialed up here, she's the Executive Director of Digital Liberty and Director of Federal Policy at Americans for Tax Reform. Most of her work is focused on deregulation to spur the adoption and proliferation of new technologies that deliver internet connectivity and applications that take advantage of enhanced networks. That's a mouthful. Katie can handle it, I promise you. Next is Eli Dorado. He is a senior research fellow at CGO. After many years working on a wide array of technology policy issues, Eli is currently focused on accelerating transformative technology change and driving faster economic growth. Welcome, Eli. And last but certainly not least, an old friend of mine, Carl Szabo, Vice President and General Counsel for NetChoice and Adjunct Professor at George Mason's Antonin Scalia Law School. He works to keep the internet safe for free expression and free enterprise, a tiny little job that takes no time out of his day. Yeah, I think he sits around and pets puppies for the rest of the day, a normal afternoon. All right, let's go ahead and jump in. We have opted to forego opening statements, believing that that just puts the audience to sleep. And so we're just going to get right to the heart of some conversation here. So let's do a little bit of table setting. And for that, I'm going to come to you, Eli. Give me the rundown, the background of how tech policy issues at the state level fit into the big picture of tech policy issues.
Sure. Well, thanks, Bartlett. Yeah, so I look at information technology as one of the very few bright spots in the economy over the last decade. Our devices get significantly better, both in terms of hardware and software every single year. I can't even imagine going back to the phones of like 10 years ago. It would be terrible. So when I look out at the economy, I see IT as this one sector that basically works. And I see many other sectors that don't work, right? Health, housing, transportation, energy, like none of those have seen the kinds of progress that we have seen in IT. And in some cases, we have seen things move backwards. So my fundamental view is that, legislators should be focused on trying to fix the broken sectors, not, targeting the ones that work just, because they're sexy or interesting and novel. So I would really like to see, more focus on particularly technological solutions in those other sectors, rather than sort of ganging up and piling up on the IT sector, where it basically works.
Thank you. Perfect way to kick this off. Katie, let's come to you for this one. So it's hard to put into an easy descriptor, and we could do a whole video on this alone, but technology is so intertwined, both technologically, with the wires to wires of literally, but then also with agreements and contracts and partnerships, that I think sometimes the implications on the ecosystem are forgotten. But when I think about when states tax and regulate internet-based services, these regulations, they end up affecting the whole country. And we've seen some major issues with this before. But what's been your observations and your experience with state-based internet regulations?
Yeah, so one of the biggest ones that we ran into over the past few years was California, which they do this across all sectors, but trying to regulate for the entire American economy. And, states need to be careful of this. And certainly these overly restrictive laws, most Republican legislatures were not interested in the California version of net neutrality or the California version of privacy laws. And, one of the things that I think these legislators don't think about is that laws like this that affect the rest of the country, they certainly come under legal challenges. And taxpayers pay the cost of these legal challenges to these laws that are on their face, and we see them coming as being unconstitutional. So there are challenges to both of these laws in California, and those rules are not really something that we want for the rest of the country. And, kind of bringing that into the app-based context, if we look at, trying to get at deplatforming or some of these other issues that people are really concerned about, talking about side loading or different payment options doesn't really get to that, but maybe looking at things that are state-based, like transparency issues or maybe contractual agreements dealing with terms of service, those might be something that states can do. But these big, broad sweeping things saying this is how the internet is going to work it's not great to be on either side of that.
Absolutely. Let's come back to you for a minute, Eli. I'm going to risk Carl getting upset that I haven't brought him in yet, but I promise I'm going to get to you, Carl. But Eli, let's come back to you for a second, and I'm going to pluck a thread from what Katie was talking about there, and particularly on tech platforms. So what is the right level? Where and how should tech platforms be regulated?
Yeah, so I think Katie's right on there. I think in general you don't want it to be at the state level. And the problem is, as Katie said, that a lot of times tech rules can have these extraterritorial effects. And in some cases, some states are doing that on purpose. But I think even if they're not doing it on purpose, like it's not great to have those extraterritorial effects. So, consider what happened in Europe with the GDPR and cookie notices, right? Like, so the GDPR made the web worse for everyone on the entire planet. All these cookie notices you have to click just to get to the content you want. So that is that's a globally hated law that that sort of is imposed on us by the European Union. And we don't, it's not a good idea for our states to be basically following that pattern and having laws that could have that extraterritorial effect. So I think if we need tech regulations, they should be at the national or international level and minimize, to minimize the number of these extra jurisdictional negative effects that are created. But ideally, we would tread very carefully. We'd instead try to work cooperatively with the industry to develop norms that make sense. And instead of imposing policies that could have these negative unintended consequences like the GDPR.
Yeah, I've often wondered if anyone has ever read any of those notices, much less all of those notices. I have skimmed a couple, and frankly, they're all written differently, of course, because every lawyer, I can tell you as being a lawyer, something comes on your desk and you have to do something to improve whatever it was that was put on your desk, and you end up with words starting to diverge from each other. And so I don't have any idea how a average consumer online, or frankly, someone schooled in the law online is reading these and actually understanding what the products are being delivered and how it's going to comply. It's absolutely nuts, which is kind of the worst of all laws, right? Laws that make our life harder and fail to do what their goal was. It's awful. All right, Carl, this is your big time. Carl, let's get a little deeper on specifics. And I know you particularly are adept in these areas on specific policies. So we'll come back to platforms. Let's go to kind of a platform in a way, but and we'll come back to apps a little bit later, but let's talk about Turo for a second. So I've heard of this Turo tax. I've got to admit, I don't know much about it at all. But what I do understand, I'm wondering, if Hertz and Alamo and others are paying rental car taxes, shouldn't peer-to-peer services like Turo be doing the same? And what is the implication for states? Should they be doing it? A quick vignette. I know when I go to DFW, for example, from here, and I rent a car, I pay whatever I pay. I'll make this up, $59 a day to rent a car, and then I pay $60 a day in services fees and taxes that I'm not even sure what they go for. Probably for local citizenry, not for me as a visitor. But anyway, if they're all doing it, shouldn't that be Turo's situation as well?
One of the things when it comes to travel taxes, and Grover Norquist has a great line on this, states love them because there's nothing better than taxing people who can't vote you out of office. And that's essentially what you see with these types of travel taxes. That's why, Bartlett, when you land at DFW and you're suddenly seeing 20, 30% on top of the original cost of the rental being lobbed on, you're like, whoa, what's going on here? Well, you know what? The lawmakers in Austin, city council usually, really have or in Dallas, have no incentive to lower those taxes because guess what? You can't vote them out of office. So what's going on here? And one of the overarching themes that I think has been kind of percolating a lot of the tech discussions, and Eli's talked about this and Katie's talked about this, is what is essentially corporate competitors using legislation to get competitive advantages. And that's kind of what you're seeing with some of these laws. More often than not, especially in the case of what's called the Turo tax, nice and alliterative, and I'll explain that in a moment, is you're seeing corporate competitors being the ones to advance them. So the elevator pitch is, hey, when Bartlett, you land and you have to pay 30% rental car fee when you rent at DFW, but then Turo or GetAround or some other similar platform, which is a peer-to-peer car sharing service. The way to think of it is, I'm going to lend you, it's like Airbnb for cars, probably the elevator pitch if you wanted to make one. They're like, well, why aren't they paying these rental car fees? If it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it should be taxed like a duck. Well, first of all, I think none of them should be taxed. That's always a good solution. It's always amazing when you're seeing states advocate for more taxes when they're enjoying incredible budget surpluses, much to their surprise. But this legislation, we're seeing it pop up in two unusual suspects in particular. One is Alaska, one is New Hampshire. New Hampshire, which prides itself on low taxes. So the overarching idea for peer-to-peer car sharing, how many of us have our cars just sitting right now? Wouldn't it be great if you could make some money off it? Well, that's kind of what these platforms are trying to do. They're trying to empower us as individuals to make our cars available to others who need them in real time. And a lot of these car sharings are actually not travelers from out of state. They're people from in-state. The other day, my wife had to go pick up a whole bunch of stuff from Home Depot. We unfortunately, we've got an SUV, but we don't have a big truck. We need a big truck. So I was able to hop on to Fluid Truck and find a truck from one of my neighbors, go and pick it up, take it over, get the stuff, return the truck. It was great. It was simple. It was easy. And that neighbor was able to make some revenue on their truck when it wasn't being used. Okay, so that's kind of the business model. So why shouldn't we apply the same taxes that we apply to Hertz and Avis to things like Turo and Fluid Truck? Well, two reasons, and this is also going to be a common theme with a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about today. One, you can't do it legally. And two, even if you could do it legally, it's a bad policy decision. So with respect to the legals, we've talked about kind of the extraterritorial reaches, right? So we don't like the idea that California can tell, Sacramento can tell people in Tallahassee what to do and how to live their lives. Same thing, we don't want people out in Brussels telling people in Baltimore how to live. Well, the same thing holds true for the folks in Anchorage and Concord. If you have a business that's not based in your state, you can't tell them how to do their business. And if you want to turn on your own citizens and say, okay, people renting the cars, sharing your cars, you're going to have to pay this tax. You can do that, but you can't hold a foreign business liable. So legally, they can't do it. Second, when it comes to the policy and why you shouldn't do it, these taxes are A, new taxes, and B, Turo and Fluid are nothing like Hertz and Avis and others, even though they claim to, the advocates claim for them to be similar. So when I began looking at these issues, I actually was discovered that every year, the rental car industry gets a $3.5 billion tax exemption from state taxes. And basically what this is it's called a sale for resale exemption. And you'll see this if you go to a store or if you go to a bodega or a local mart. When you look on the back of the package, it says not for resale. Well, the idea is if I go to, let's pick Best Buy. If I go to Best Buy and I go and buy a laptop, Best Buy doesn't pay the sales tax when they buy that laptop from Microsoft. I pay the sales tax when I buy it from Best Buy. It's called a sale for resale sales tax exemption. Well, for the rental car industry, their argument is, in 3 years, we're going to sell our cars as used. So therefore, we should not be subject to a sales tax because we're going to eventually resell these cars. That would be like me when I went to Best Buy and bought my computer saying, you shouldn't charge me sales tax because in 3 years after I'm done using this computer, I'm going to resell it to my neighbor. That's insane. That's absurd. But that's the exemption that the rental car companies were able to get baked into almost every single state. At the same time, they get a special tax that they're able, like a fee that they're able to pass on to you, Bartlett, when you fly into DFW. So essentially, if the argument is, it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, then I think every single person who engages in car sharing should be entitled to the same sales tax exemptions that Hertz, Avis, and Enterprise are entitled to, or they're not similar and you can't do it. Finally, is it a new tax? Well, absolutely. It's either A, a new tax, or B, if you're saying it's not a new tax, then it's always been in existence, then you're gonna go hit up every single person who's engaged in car sharing for back taxes. So you have two choices. Is it a new tax or isn't it? So it's really bad policy. It's unconstitutional. It's not a good idea. And Katie, I clearly you got
think
something.
every American needs this resale tax exemption on their cars because pretty much everybody resells their car. So I'm just throwing it out there.
Let's do it.
My lease was only for 2 years. I sold it back to the dealership. Where's my sales tax exemption?
I agree. There's no taxation with sales tax exemption or something.
I actually think everything should work that way. And everyone should just sell everything when they're done using it or donate it and get another use out of it. We could also say we're all being very green by doing so. So I think it's probably a great idea and we won't get taxed. But
well, especially since the rental car companies are struggling right now, they sold off their fleets.
So, which is a whole nother series we could do on semiconductors. But anyway, Katie, I know you're chomping at the bit for more tax stuff. So let's stay with the theme as long as we're here. So Maryland recently passed a digital ads tax, which sounds like an extraordinary idea. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Besides being a tax increase, obviously, what are some of the other problems with this legislation?
Yeah, so I'm going to go through this as quickly as possible, just kind of some basics on this like first of its kind bill that Maryland passed. And they actually passed it by overriding Governor Larry Hogan's veto. So they really wanted this like supposed $250 million in tax revenue to fill a COVID budget hole. But it looks like no one's going to have a COVID budget hole because the federal government is just out there with the money. So what this law would do is it imposes a gross revenue tax on digital ads, and the tax varies depending on the size of the company, but it can reach up to 10% of a company's global annual revenue. and this is for Maryland. This is pretty insane. And what they're doing is they're trying to go after big tech, but they're hitting all kinds of companies in the ad stack, right? And they're actually having the comptroller come up with the rules. So we don't even really know how this is going to work. Like if you've got 4 different people going through the ad stack, so you've got Google, you've got the buyer, you've got the trade desk, and you've got the person at the end. Does that 10% tax get tacked on every time? Do you end up with a 40% tax? Like, we don't really know. And we know that these taxes get passed down. Google's not going to pay the 10%. Facebook's not going to pay it. Apartments.com, they're not going to pay it. It's going to go down to me that I want to rent out my apartment. It's going to go to your local pizza shop, and your local pizza shop isn't going to be able to buy as many digital ads. These things always trickle down. It's known. The biggest problem here, though, is the lawsuits. So there has not been a tax on advertising at all. There's no tax on television advertising. There's no tax on radio advertising, newspaper, billboards, name it. There's no tax on advertising. And what does that mean? That means they're treating e-commerce in a discriminatory manner. That is a violation of the Internet Tax Freedom Forever Act. Internet Tax Freedom Forever Act says you can't do it in a discriminatory way. You can tax digital stuff less than physical things, but not more. So this is definitely going to be challenged. They're probably going to lose. Also, Internet Tax Freedom Forever does the other awesome thing of saying that no government can tax your internet access. So, and those lawsuits came really, really quickly. There was one from the US Chamber of Commerce that came right away. And then a month later, there's another lawsuit from Comcast and Verizon. So then they're talking about those particular violations. Then like the final thing from a global perspective, and this has kind of been touched on a little bit already, but right now Europe is trying to come at American companies. And they're trying to do these digital markets taxes, digital service taxes, saying that where the value is created is where we're going to tax. So not where the company is located, not where the company is headquartered, which is how it's been done forever, but now this so that they can get at American companies. USTR just announced that we're imposing tariffs on the UK and 7 other European countries because of these discriminatory taxes on American companies. And these digital markets, digital services taxes from the EU are targeted specifically at American companies. Like they don't get at their own national champions like Spotify, who might come up later. But that's sort of the global perspective. And I think states really need to think about that when they pass these kind of laws. Like, well, what Pandora's box are they opening on everyone? It's kind of the I can pick on my little brother, but you can't.
And Katie, like Connecticut's following Maryland's silly example, and you know, even Maryland's AG said, yeah, this is probably going to be unconstitutional. And as a resident of Maryland, I can just watch my tax dollars go down the toilet in legal fees, as the state will clearly lose. They will not get a single penny. And what's amazing is also you have this amazing confluence of opponents to this legislation. You've got the tech industry, the newspapers, the radio advertisers, broadcast. Everyone hates this bill. And yet,
Everyone hates it.
and to your question about is it going to be 40% in the state of Maryland if it is an option for more taxes, the answer is yes.
Right? The answer is always yes. If they think they can get more out of it, they're going to squeeze water out of rocks. That's what they're going to do. And it's really disappointing because, like you said, taxpayers are going to foot the bill for those lawsuits, and they're definitely going to lose. Connecticut shouldn't follow suit. We saw this with plenty of other ways states have tried to tax digital services.
Great colloquy, guys. And speaking, Carl, of squeezing money out of where you can in payments, let's switch for a moment to apps. Just to signal to everybody, want to shift a little bit. Although I will say, Katie mentioned Spotify and Pandora's box. I'll take from that Pandora, so Pandora and Spotify. So maybe that was a nice segue to apps anyway. But we've seen a whole bunch of proposals around the country related to app stores. Fill us in. What's the argument on this issue? Aren't these stores monopolies? Let's see, what else? Shouldn't app developers just be able to use payment services that they want, just like the pizza place that's going to charge me more for pepperoni pizza because of the ads? And then I guess finally, why is there a carve out for video games?
Okay, so a lot to unpack there. And this also gets back to the ongoing theme of how can I use legislation to take down people I don't like? Katie alluded to the European Digital Services Tax. How do I use legislation to take down American businesses? I talked about how can I use legislation to take down corporate competitors like Turo and GetAround and people just renting their cars. Well, there's a little lawsuit going on that was briefly mentioned in the newspaper. It's Epic v. Apple, probably everyone's heard of it. And the long story short is when you make a purchase through an app store, whether it is through an Apple product, whether it is through an Xbox, a PlayStation, a Nintendo Switch, pretty much even Epic Games Store, they charge service fees. And they do this because that's how they make money. Let me give a quick yarn. Imagine I go out and I build a mall and I encourage people to come and open stores in my mall. And because I want to encourage them to open, I'm gonna say, you know what, I'm not really gonna charge you on the front end. I'm not gonna charge you monthly rent, but what we'll do is a service fee. So we'll do percentage of revenue instead of a monthly rental fee for space. And you say, okay, that makes sense. You know, if I have a bad month, I owe less money. If I choose to not charge for anything, well, I, as the mall owner, I'm just up a creek. I actually lose money on that transaction. Or in the same moment, somebody comes into the mall, they decide they don't want to shop there, and they drive down the road to Best Buy or Target or a different store entirely. That's essentially the scenario that's being played out here, where Apple and Google have created stores, just like Microsoft has with the Xbox, just like Sony has with PlayStation, just like Nintendo has with the Switch. They've created stores, and they've said, developers, rather than charging you a regular monthly rental fee to just even be here, we're going to charge you a service fee on transactions. And the people say, okay, that's good. You have some services like Netflix who do not want to pay the transaction fee at all. So if you were to go on your iPhone right now or your Android device and try to sign up for Netflix service, you cannot. You can only do it at netflix.com. You can still do that on your smartphone or any other device, but you can't do it through the device. That means Apple and Google do not get a single penny from Netflix for hosting that app. But that's not good enough for services like Spotify and Epic. They don't want to pay a service fee. They think they're special. They think it's unfair. And anytime somebody talks about unfairness, I always say, hold on to your wallets. So they would prefer a system where they don't have to pay Apple or Google anything for the development, innovation, advertising, customer care, everything that's provided. They would just rather have their cake and eat it too. So Epic has decided to try and fight this in court. They're probably going to lose based on what we saw from the judge. Same time, Epic, Spotify, and Match Group, they are famous for Tinder. For those of you who don't know, it's the swipe right app. They basically created a coalition, and they decided, well, we can't win in court. Well, we can't win in the public sphere. We are going to win in legislation. And that's what we've seen introduced in a bunch of states. We saw it introduced in Georgia, Arizona, Louisiana, a couple others. But the good news is state lawmakers are smarter. State lawmakers on face, they might think, oh, this is a great idea. And then as they begin digging a little deeper, they start to realize this isn't about protecting consumers. This is corporate competition posing as consumer benefits. And so every single one of those states rejected this approach. And we continue to expect to see it, because at the end of the day, this is the free market working. Because if Epic doesn't want to pay Apple a single penny, they can just say, go to epicgames.com on your phone and buy your V-Bucks. Go to the local supermarket where you can buy a gift card of V-Bucks. Same thing Netflix has done. Spotify could do the same thing itself. So the market is working, and I'm really encouraged to say that lawmakers are smarter. than these corporate competitors are giving them credit for.
So let's see, I'm going to swipe right on your comments and swipe left on taxes. Did I get that correct? I think I did.
You
all
know,
right.
I'm not on Tinder, so I don't even know anything about these dating apps. I'm a happily married man of 10 years, so you may know more than I do, Bartlett.
So you were dating before that dates you, you realize you were dating before these things were
I was
around.
dating before dating apps were cool. Yeah.
Very, very nice. Very nice. The old school dating app, actually talking to people. Anyway, so Eli, let's get you back involved here before you get upset about being ignored. So let's continue talking about some of the payment mechanisms and the app stores. What do you think would happen if states start forcing tech companies to allow additional app store payment mechanisms?
Well, I think that the app stores would become a flea market, right? You'd get the platforms themselves sort of enforce rules on like how apps can ask for money, right? And that would all go away. So you'd have apps, every app trying to push you to like their own proprietary payment system. You would, your payment data would get spread all over the globe, right? So like if you buy, an app from a Bulgarian developer, like you don't think twice about the fact that you have, you have to give them your data, because you don't. You give your data to Apple or Google, and they handle the payment. And so now if you're the developer from any other country, like you have to think about, well, if I'm giving them my credit card information, by the way, I'm giving them my home address, to authenticate the credit card. That data gets spread all over the web, right? The one thing we know about what happens on the web is that there are data breaches, right? So and I not only have my data on hundreds of different servers in sort of random countries, but it's going to get breached from time to time, and then that can be used to sort of target me for other cyber attacks. So I think it's really it could be really damaging. And then take the logic one step further. If I know that my data is going to go out like that, say I'm an enlightened app user, then what I'm going to do is I'm not going to trust the developer in the first place. I'm not going to make the purchase. So it shrinks the total market size. And then if I'm a developer, right, like I have to I'm going to want to create a payment system for every country, because these are not globalized systems, instead of just relying on a single Apple or Google run front end for payments. I have to do all this work. So so the quality is not going to be very high in terms of the payment systems, because all this developer, all this developer talent has to be wasted and sort of getting a minimum viable payment system across for every app. So I think that simplicity in the payment system has real value for the consumer, and individual companies are always gonna not want to pay that cut, but for the user experience, it's much better if there's a single point, there's rules on how you're allowed to ask for payments, and everything has to, all the subscriptions have to be easily cancelable, and so on. That adds a ton of value. I think that the other thing that would happen is that tech companies would raise prices elsewhere in their ecosystem, right? So like your device prices would go up, which also reduces the market size for apps. So in part, what is happening here is that heavy phone users, or at least heavy app purchasers, are cross-subsidizing the light users right now, right? So if you effectively told Apple and Google that they can't make money off of app sales, that cross-subsidy would go away, and you'd probably get higher upfront charges for buying a phone. So grandma would have to pay more for her phone, but at least her in-app purchases would be a few percent cheaper, right? So it's not a great outcome for everybody, and I think that the current model is designed to sort of make the entry costs very affordable for people, because the tech companies they're going to make money down the road, so it allows them to charge less for their devices up front and get more people in the door and get the app economy going. So I think it really would be damaging to try to muck about with this, with the payment systems, and just the system, it works pretty well, and we shouldn't try to mess around with it.
So,
I mean,
what do you think states should be doing instead of regulating the app stores?
I think as I said earlier, I think it's like we should be focusing on sort of non-digital tech, right? So go after, think about things like biotech, right, and energy and transportation. There's an amazing thing going on in this country right now with with this, driven by the pandemic, of course, which is the new remote economy, right? And so states should be trying to attract tech workers to their states and try to think about what kinds of policies they could enact that would encourage people to move to their states and contribute to their local economy. And then I think another thing is preparing for new game-changing technologies, as Wyoming has done, for example, with cryptocurrency, right? So that, look to the future, right? Look to the future and think about what's the next thing on the horizon, and how can we win at that thing, rather than this is kind of backwards looking, say the thing about the 2010s was Apple and Google and all the success that phones and apps have had, right? So look to the future instead of looking to the past.
Well, and Bartlett, if I can comment on what Eli just said about looking to the future and how do you attract those tech workers, how do you get them there? One of the things that state legislators can really look into is promoting the 5G networks and the coming of 5G networks. And a lot of that has to do with my favorite thing, deregulation, or moving a lot quicker, approving those requirements for small cells to go out. And then also looking at the people who build that infrastructure. So maybe legislators want to look at community colleges or vocational schools and, train tower techs so that we have more people to deploy that infrastructure. Because if you want to see the challengers to the major companies today, we need the networks of tomorrow. And the only way that we get there is the faster that we deploy those.
Perfect. Perfect. And I love that you set the broader table, because I think that is often missing in these conversations. We get hyper focused on something like an app store, which is really super important to those companies, but is not necessarily important in the broad scheme of the ecosystem, but the economy, et cetera. And so we end up train wrecking something where we have those ripples, as you guys talked about earlier, that causes lots of damage, instead of enhancing the marketplace for everybody, including the app stores and including workers. To me, it's so obvious. But all right, before I go off down that path, audience, I'm going to give you the 2-minute heads up. I'm going to come to you for questions in 2 minutes. And in those 2 minutes, Carl, I'd love to get your 120, 115 second thoughts on bias bills. What are these and what's going on in the States?
There is a lot of frustration out there amongst conservatives. Look, I have it sometimes too, the perceived anti-conservative bias in social media. And you hear the anecdotes, my friend's mother's uncle's sister was put in social media jail because they said something offensive. And that's just yet another example of how liberal social media is trying to shut down conservatives. And look, I'm not going to try to dispel somebody's feelings. If you feel like this is happening, I can't prove a negative. It's just one of those things you can't do. One thing that's worth thinking about, though, is it possible you only hear about other conservatives being removed because you only talk to other conservatives, and maybe there are liberals being removed on the far left and you just don't hear about it because you don't talk to people on the far left? So that's one thing to think about. But anyways, this is coming to a head where we've seen a number of states introduce legislation designed to force platforms to host content they don't want. What type of content? Here's an example. Tide Pod Challenge is one of the examples. Examples of actual physical harm. That's where kids were eating Tide Pods. Yeah, it's stupid, but hey, probably the content you don't want to see up there. Here's another example. What's called the knockout game. This is where people on social media were encouraging each other to run around and try to literally punch people in the face, complete strangers in the face. Let's use another example. People who are denying certain events happened, like the Holocaust or like a shooting that occurred. This is not the type of content that we want on our social media platforms. Child grooming, I haven't even discussed about profanity or pornography, all the things that I as a parent don't want to see on social media platforms. But we are seeing pushes by state lawmakers to force platforms to host speech they do not want. Why is this a problem? It's a problem for two reasons. One, it's a violation of the First Amendment. Now remember, our founding fathers specifically worried about state-run media. We do not want government-compelled speech. State-run media is when the government forces you to say something you don't want to say. That's what we're seeing here. It's a very authoritarian and very scary thing. The second reason that we oppose this is because we want to encourage private businesses to decide what's best for their users and their platforms. And if you're a conservative like me and you believe in decisions like Hobby Lobby, Masterpiece Cake, and Citizens United, it's hard to square the circle of private businesses can decide what's best for their users and at the same time, except for when it hurts me. So that's what you're seeing. And before we jump into questions, I think taking it 10,000, real quickly, only one state has actually passed this into law. That is Florida. NetChoice, along with CCIA, is currently suing under the First Amendment. No other state has enacted this law. Louisiana just ended it for the year, so good for them. But at a 10,000 foot level, if you're worried about liberal social media platforms, the correct answer is encourage those businesses, encourage those employees to come to your states, to come to conservative states, to come to other states and see what life is like. And maybe that's how you better change the views and opinions of somebody who disagrees with you, is by actually engaging them and encouraging them to come and be part of your community. And then they will take those values internally and use them as they apply it to their private businesses.
Always knew you were a radical, Carl. Radical idea, talk to people. So, all right, speaking of talking, we have an audience out there. We've been talking at them. Now they get to ask us questions and we can engage. Folks, if you have a question, click the Q&A function below and pop your question in. And we have one from anonymous attendee. I love it. I'm just going to read this straight up to y'all, and folks feel free to jump in. When it comes to how state legislators are approaching tech issues, in a sentence or two, there you go, in a sentence or two, what would be your best piece of advice on how to approach them? So when it comes to how state legislators are approaching tech issues, what would be your best piece of advice on how to approach them?
I will very quickly say, again, deregulation. If you go to atr.org/rules, you'll see a bunch of rules that were waived at the states and the federal level during COVID. And a lot of those help the proliferation of telemedicine. So I think looking at some of those rules that were waived during COVID and seeing what can continue on.
That was going to be, I will +1 on the deregulation. Remember, regulation is competition prevention for incumbents. So going back to the issue of quote unquote big tech, if you are truly frustrated at their influence, the worst thing you can do is further entrench them by creating regulations that prevent new entrants from coming and competing directly with them head on.
I would just say, like, if you focus, everything is a tech issue at some level, right? Like every sector of the economy needs technology, right? And so let's focus on the sectors where the technology isn't working, instead of focusing on, ultimately a lot of the technology, a lot of the social media is entertainment fundamentally, right? And so it's like, we really need to, it's a lot of legislators spending time fixing this, sort of relatively trivial sector that is it is basically working. And there's all these other much more important sectors of the economy that are broken, where there is no innovation, where prices are going up every year instead of going down every year. And let's focus on those instead.
So important, Eli. I represented technology broadly at a trade association for a dozen years, literally a dozen years in the states and at the federal level. And I find the fixation on communications technology to be bewildering, to the extent that the typical press reporter now refers to it as the technology industry, and it is parroted by policymakers across the board now. And I think, when you pass these rules, forget what it does to Facebook for a minute. Let's forget Facebook exists. Forget Turo exists. You're going to wind up bringing in a whole host of laws, regulations that affect business technology, for example, government technology, for example, and it's not even considered, absolutely not considered. All right, I'll end my rant there to get to the next question, which I'm really excited to hear you guys answer about, because I have mixed feelings about this one. The question is from Ty. How do you feel about Commissioner Carr's proposal to tax big tech in order to pay for the Universal Service Fund? Katie, I'm going to come to you unfairly perhaps, but since you mentioned broadband earlier, I'm going to come to you.
Look, I think it's a really interesting proposal. And I have heard this proposal before. I had not heard it expressed quite so clearly as it was in his op-ed. And I know there's been some interest expressed in this as an option. I'm not sure how that works. If we're talking about taxing digital ads. Are we taxing data? Are we taxing revenues? And is this an internet tax? Is it a fee? And that's how you get around the tax word. I don't know, but it's an interesting conversation to have, because you've got a lot of these companies that have built out the networks that everything else runs on, and they're the ones that bear the brunt of the cost, but not as much of the value. And then you still got a lot of people out there who are unconnected. And the Universal Service Fund is collapsing in on itself because the people who are paying for that are only the voice customers. So just the voice portion of my phone is what is part of that tax. And you can see mobile taxes go up to 30% in some places. I mean, I think Nebraska is the one that's topping 30%, but there are other states with very high taxes on mobile phones. And a lot of that goes towards the Universal Service Fund, either at the federal and the state level. And if it's a priority to close the digital divide, if we're trying to get people connected, we need to think about ways to continue moving that forward. I mean, and I love the answer that's always SpaceX, satellite broadband. It's going to be amazing. We don't need this money anymore. That's my favorite answer. But, sometimes we have to think about, how are these programs going to survive? Do they need to survive? Commissioner Carr has an interesting idea. There's also the idea that it moves to an appropriation strategy rather than going through the FCC. That's a possibility. So a lot of ideas have been kicked around, but I think Commissioner Carr's op-ed is valuable for the conversation.
Thank you. If you guys have anything to add, jump in. If not, it might not be your bailiwick. That's okay.
Well, I'll just pick up the SpaceX bit, because that's another example of non-digital technology, right? So it's an amazing American tech company called SpaceX is developing a way that they're going to have 42,000 satellites orbiting the planet at only a few hundred kilometers away from the surface,
and they are going to 1,700.
And it's crazy, and they are going to provide satellite service that's orders of magnitude better than the satellite service that existed in the past, and basically solve the broadband infrastructure problem with technology. Right? There's not with regulation, not with law, not with taxes, but with entrepreneurship and technology. And that's the way to address a lot of these issues is with looking to the future and leveraging new kinds of technology that solve the problem directly, not through a heavy-handed government program.
I always think before we add in new taxes, we should look at the resources we have and if there's abuse and waste in the system. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find Commissioner Carr say that there is an abuse and waste in USF. By the same token, we just had a couple $1 trillion dumped into government, and I'm sure we can find some in there. Finally, there are more phones now than there were 20 years ago, right? So I have a landline in my house. My wife has a personal cell phone. I have a personal cell phone. When my kid gets old enough, they'll have a cell phone. So instead of 4 people using one phone line, we're going to end up with 4 people each having their own phone lines plus a home line. So there should be more revenue for for the USF than ever based on that metric. So I really need to ask, what is the basis for Commissioner Carr's
There's not more because the voice is all going over IP.
Okay, thank you.
It's not going over plain old telephone service anymore.
But one of the things to look at is, why is Commissioner Carr doing this? Is it about USF, or is it really about something else? Because he was one of the chief proponents of the FCC's now revoked investigation into Section 230 and other issues with big tech.
So let me pick up on this, and I've got 2 more questions in the queue. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes, so don't get too bogged down in this one, but that's a good segue, Carl, to Anonymous has come back with another question saying, big tech—
Are you sure it's the same person?
I'm going to go ahead and say it is. It's going to be like Publicis, all right? So we're going to pretend that it's all the same person. Stop puncturing my fantasies, Carl. All right, big tech. It says big tech isn't a good friend of conservatives. Why should we stand up for them in the States? Carl, I mean, since you talked on this issue most, I want to come back to you for that one.
Look, social media has been one of the best tools ever for conservatives. I live in the DC metropolitan area. You would be hard pressed to find a newspaper to do favorable coverage of conservatives. Washington Times is probably the closest you would get. Imagine the Washington Post writing a favorable article about the great work that a Republican state lawmaker or a Republican federal agency did. You can't. It's just not in their nature. That's not what they do. They don't. I don't know if the Washington Post has ever endorsed a Republican. But what does social media do? It allows Republicans to go directly to their constituents, go directly to their constituents. We can now circumvent legacy media, which has a predilection against conservatives, and talk to the voters. Now, at the same time, we need to do a better job leveraging this social media, right? We shouldn't necessarily be saying everything, all the quiet parts out loud, because we'll turn off middle American voters. But by the same token, social media is what empowered President Trump to become a candidate, to become the Republican candidate, and become the president. So the notion that social media is bad for conservatives doesn't square. And if conservatives are having issues with social media, maybe some of the stuff we need to say needs to be dialed down a little bit in the rhetoric, because in 2000, we lost that election because we turned off middle American voters and middle voters. And maybe if we tone down that rhetoric a little, we won't have issues with social media. We can still rally the base through other services, and we can actually reach those middle voters that we otherwise couldn't.
Well, I would say there's some issues that we can't deny, but also, yes, conservative speech or center-right speech proliferates on these networks. Like the top sites that are checked on Facebook, US, like pretty much every day are Fox News, Ben Shapiro, Dan, I can't remember his last name, but a lot of those folks are the top shares, top clicks on Facebook. But we do have to pay attention to things like the Hunter Biden story being quieted, and then also the discussions about the origins of COVID-19 and how that's kind of been controlled. And I think that the discussions that are coming out around that are going to be productive. And I think a lot of what Facebook is doing with their oversight board, Facebook has made a lot of mistakes, but I think they're trying really, really hard. And I think they're showing a lot of strides. And I think the oversight board is something that we should really pay attention to and see as a positive step.
Katie, I really love that framing, because just for my 2 cents worth, what drives me batty on, frankly, a lot of populist issues, if I can call them that, is this desire to solve for perfection. And I want to urge everyone to look in the mirror. Do that one day, and you tell me if you solve for perfection. And if the answer is yes, you go to the head of the class, and I bet Facebook could learn something. We could all learn something from you. If not, maybe we need a little bit margin of grace in understanding if there is a response, particularly if you're a market person, like I think we all are here, and hopefully most of the audience agrees, that the market's going to respond to those kind of inequities and work itself out. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen in 12 seconds. It's not going to happen maybe even a month, but it will happen. And I think that's why. I think that's where whether somebody's a friend or not of conservatives, we should all stand on that principle and let those things work themselves out. And only in the very, very rare instance where the market has become a complete failure, maybe then we should discuss another solution. Eli, if you have a word or two to put in, and then I'm going to beg everybody for 3 more minutes, see if we can squeeze in this last question and then out.
Yeah, I was just going to say something similar to you, Bartlett. Principles, right? Like that's what conservatives should stand for: is principles of entrepreneurship and rewarding economic success, and not punishing it.
Awesome. See, I knew I loved you more than these guys anyway. All right. So, let's see. Last question is from Rob. And this is back to broadband. So I'm going to start with you again, Katie, because you've done. Are fiber optics a better way to get the internet to rural areas using already existing phone lines? Would that make rural residents feel easier about radiation health issues or surveillance?
Ooh, wow, that's got a lot packed into it.
Yes, it does.
So, wow. Okay, so fiber to rural residents, I would not say is necessarily the top choice. For some folks, that might work out, but when we're looking at connecting the last bit of the totally unserved, so people without any access whatsoever, we need to look at the whole mix. Fixed wireless is a really good option. Fixed wireless is not 5G, but it's a setup that can get you pretty high speeds in areas. There are a lot of small, they're called WISPs. So small networks that are doing a lot to connect people in rural areas, and they've made huge strides. Again, I'm going to go back to the satellite broadband, SpaceX, Kuiper, OneWeb. Like we're seeing a lot of great things going on there. When you're talking about surveillance, I'm going to kind of sidestep that one because it will take me a really long time to answer that. But I would not necessarily say that any one technology is better for protecting you against surveillance. You need to protect yourself, and there are laws that do that. If we had passed electronic communications privacy reform that required a warrant for your email content, then I would feel a lot better about it. But there are definitely laws, anti-snooping, deep packet inspection, things that cannot be done via these technologies. So fiber does have some protections, but these are all legal. They keep you from being snooped on at the core. More likely it's going to be your activities across any of the networks where there might be some kind of invasion of privacy. And that's why I brought up the Electronic Communications Privacy Act.
All right, Katie, I'm going to use this as your last word in there too. How do we get in touch with you when they want that broader discussion on surveillance?
So the best way to find me is at Digital Liberty on Twitter. That's with 2 L's. And my blog is digitalliberty.net.
All right, now Eli, let's go to you. Anything you want to respond to Rob on fiber optics, rural connectivity, and then make sure to give us your coordinates as well.
No, I think Katie's right on. You have to look at the whole mix of connectivity options. And you can find me on Twitter at Eli Dorado and the CGO at thecgo.org.
Awesome. Carl, that means I'm giving you the final thought. Feel free to fill in anything there in about 30 seconds, either on the rural broadband or whatever else, and then make sure we get your coordinates.
Let's get everyone connected and let's all work to make the internet a more civil place. I think the free market will help us along, but we also need to help the free market by being decent to each other. You can follow me at Carl Szabo on Twitter, and you can learn more about what we're up to over at NetChoice, the state of the lawsuit in Florida, at netchoice, netchoice.org.
So thank you to the panel. Thank you to the audience. Thank you, CGO. Thank you, NetChoice, for participating and helping to host. Until we see you again on next CGO event or ALEC event or NetChoice event, stay safe, stay engaged, and stay innovative. I'm Bartlett Clellan. Look forward to seeing you guys out there. Bye.